Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third of these webinar series. Yeah, we're excited to see the attendance. It's quite a good one considering it's towards the end of the year. There's obviously quite a bit of interest from the work at Hartspoint, so I think we're going to get into it. So just again, covering the webinar, the third one of the series. This one is going to be covered by Protekta. Unfortunately, we don't have the OEMs that are more knowledgeable than Anderson Cilia, so we're very lucky to have his brains with us today. He'll be presenting the discussion. Just a quick agenda. So for the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to do a quick introduction and expectations. So we are going to cover how we approach PPE. We're just going to give you a quick intro into that. The webinar conduct, just to make sure it runs smoothly, and the expected outcomes, and then I'll hand over to Anderson. Anderson will have between 50 minutes and an hour and a half. It just depends on how the questions work. So if there's questions throughout, we do ask people to engage. If you don't necessarily want to put your hand up and ask a question directly, feel free. I'll be monitoring the questions in the boxes, in the chat box. Feel free to drop a question there if there's something interesting. If there's something really interesting, I'll ask Anderson to stop and tackle that one for everyone to hear. So just a quick side of Protekta. So Protekta, we see ourselves as PPE solutionists. We like to think we can bring solutions and expertise, and we really have a good grip on dealing with OEMs and understanding clients' issues. So from foot protection, eye protection, respiratory, confined space, hand protection, head protection, hearing protection, and of course today, fall protection is one of our strengths from a subject matter expertise and what we have to offer. So I do hope everyone finds value in that. Just a quick conduct, so making sure this runs smoothly and nobody gets irritated with anyone else. So we do have the mics on for them to obviously allow for questions if that happens. But I do ask if we can, if you've got a question, if you can put your hand up, Anderson will let you know then when he's ready to take that question, and we will handle it as quickly as possible. Videos, you can turn them on, but ideally we've seen obviously the quality of the feed does drop. So I think Anderson will start it off with switching on his video just so everyone knows who they're talking or who's talking, and he'll then switch off his and carry on as such. Just onto the question side of things. So we do want engagement. Very well done. We do want engagement, so please, whether it's raising the hand or whether it's dropping it in the chat box, we will engage with those questions. And just a general note, so this session is being recorded, so we do offer it afterwards from a, you can obviously go view it afterwards if there were interesting things that you found or you want to share it with colleagues. It will be available for everyone afterwards. We do put it onto YouTube on the Protekta site. Okay, and then the idea for these sessions. So we've had some really good value and we've had some really good feedback up to now. So we do want to create valuable exchanges. You guys are dealing with your speciality, whether that means you're creating explosives or making food or doing that stuff. I mean, that's what your guys' general priority is. And to handle all of these safety aspects in between them starts becoming very difficult to stay up to date with what's happening in the industry, to stay up to date with new technologies, new best practices, new standards and legislations. So we like to see ourselves being able to bring the two together. So from a subject matter expertise, we have a team, but we heavily linked to the OEMs, get them involved, make sure that we understand and make sure our clients get to speak to them directly. So that's what these sessions are about. And yeah, the main point is obviously at the end of the day, everyone's here, I think, to increase safety. So there's a huge drive from that. If I can ask, I know I ask every single week or every session, feedback is hugely valuable. It guides us. It makes us offer something better for the next round. If there's pertinent issues that you guys are having on site, please share that. Let us know what the site issues are. Let us know what the next session could be, what would add value. And yeah, that's how we keep this thing being valuable. So just a quick one about Anderson. So Anderson Cilia is our training manager. So he's one of the most knowledgeable people you will find in both work at heights and confined space. So I think we've got a really good value from getting him and getting a bit of his time today. A bit personal about Anderson. So just so everyone knows, he used to jump out of planes. I'm pretty sure that's where his obsession with work at heights started, but then changed, and now he doesn't even want to fly. So there's a bit of a weird thing happening there. I don't know, maybe he can explain that to us. And the big thing you'll know about Anderson, if you do know him, is he's a huge family person. So his lovely daughter, his lovely son, and his beautiful wife, that's his number one in life. And if you met him, I'm pretty sure you would agree with that. So without further ado, I think we're going to hand over to Anderson, and I hope this is a valuable session.
Great, thank you very much, Dylan, for that introduction. I'll on personal comments, I'll make the note of the aircraft. Why I don't like flying. There's various reasons I can give for that, but we won't go into that detail today. So just for everybody's sake, just to see who's actually presenting today, thank you very much for everybody joining today and taking out your time in your busy schedules. I think Dylan already mentioned the fact that it's end of the year, so it's getting a bit hectic. So we appreciate your attendance and hope the session is informative. I just want to quickly share my screen. I'm going to then turn off my camera, and then we can commence with the session. So as indicated by Dylan, the topic for today is selection and legislation, obviously covering fall protection equipment. So there's a lot of things we can say about that, and obviously a lot of things that we can discuss legal wise. I mean, you've got the whole OSH Act, and there's a lot of detail regarding that we can look at. But I think today is not going to be a typical legal presentation. I tried to make it as interestingly as possible. I try to focus on a few case studies, give a few examples of certain of the topics that I'm going to cover today. So as Dylan indicated, please, as I go through, you'll find that I talk a little bit fast sometimes. So please, if there's anything that I'm talking over too quickly, please stop me, ask me the questions so we can discuss that. So just to emphasize what Dylan said, relevant legislation for working rights, we're just going to cover a few points there. Closing the gaps between legislation and international best practice. And it's a topic that some of the guys that attended the previous workshops will see that I love using that slide. And I think for me personally, it's a very important slide, an important point, because every day, you know, you're looking for legal compliance, but is that sufficient? And we're going to just discuss a few aspects regarding that. Have a quick few slides regarding standards, EN SANS, touch on the ISO standards, because obviously that's very important for our industry. Everything must be standardized, and there must be specifications and requirements for all the equipment that you're using. So we're just going to touch on a few points there. And then obviously the more practical side or case study side is where we're going to look at the considerations, looking at selecting fall protection equipment, which in itself is a bit of a feat, but I'm going to try and make it as simple as possible, hopefully. So with that being said, let's jump in. And obviously, you know, I've used this a few times as well, but I think it's a brilliant message to bring across. And it says sometimes it takes a good fall to really know where you stand. Unfortunately, in our industry, with the high-risk environment, working rights, working on top of structures, anything can happen. You fall, and then only you realize after that fall what has happened, what is missing, what was outstanding, what not done. And obviously, the whole idea behind these workshops, and which I think Dylan has created, is brilliant, is that we want to provide information that can assist the clients to actually prevent getting to a point like that. We don't want anybody to fall, but if there should something happen, worst case scenario, you need to make sure, or we want to make sure that everything is looked after. And it was just one of those incidents that happened that we don't want to let it happen again. But this is why we do these things. And obviously, it's very important that we discuss these points as well. If we jump into the legislation immediately, very important as well. Obviously, I've started with a few definitions, and these definitions is not because I see it as important. It's actually coming directly out of your construction regulations. Talking specifically about working rights, obviously, you'll see the first definition there talking about a full risk. And a very important point, because you know, if you look at these days, that is the golden rule guiding anything or everywhere where people are exposed to working rights or working in a full risk position. So they define it as anywhere where a person is exposed to falling from, off, or into. You know, it's a very a very short, concise definition, but it opens up a lot of discussions normally when you get into a site, because these days you still see clients working from 1.8 meters, 1.5 meters. You know, they still use the restrained lanyards when the guys are working between 2 to 3 meters, feeling that, you know, the guys can still hit the ground. Why do they need shock absorbing lanyards? And it's very close to the ground. So, but at the end of the day, it's very important to understand the definition, but also to practically implement this definition through typical documents like your site-specific fall protection plans is very important. So a good understanding about how to manage working rights, look at the risk areas, the activities, and then putting appropriate measures in place, I feel, is one of the keys to making sure that you actually look after your safety of your personnel, but actually practically providing solutions to make sure they can actually perform that work effectively. So the other definition is your fall prevention, fall arrest equipment. Fall prevention equipment, obviously, you know, they can mention a few ones there like body harness, lanyards, lifelines, guardrails, screens, barricades, and obviously fall prevention is always your first option when you have to work at height. But a very important definition, because as a person that needs to manage working at height activities on your site, these are very important to keep in mind. And obviously it's part of your legislation, so you have to, as far as possible and reasonably practicable, comply to these. Fall arrest, it says equipment used to arrest a person in a fall. So obviously there you look at the scenario that if you have to put a guy at an exposed position where he's actually on a rooftop, he's got limited anchor points, he's hooking up at his feet, you need to make sure that you use the appropriate equipment and obviously have all your planning in place to make sure that should something happen, you know, you've got your shock absorbing elements, you decrease your fall clearances, to make sure that it, you know, at the end of the day, it is managed properly and obviously preventing the end where a person might be suspended and actually exposed to physically dying in that harness. The last one there, competency, and this is again in our industry a very touchy point, because training and competency is very important. I mean, when you train a person for working at heights, he needs to be a skilled person to not only, you know, fit the harness properly, but how does he approach the working at height solutions and the working at height environment in a way that he can use that harness and lanyard appropriately. How does he integrate the use of a temporary lifeline or a rescue system? And how does he plan for a rescue scenario when he's actually exposed to that environment? So these definitions, as per legislation, is a very important part of the requirements for working at height, but also understanding and using these effectively in your approach towards working at heights is extremely important. And training for me, obviously, because I'm the training manager, I would say this, but you know, even in my experience throughout the years, training is where the foundation is laid and where the guys are being exposed to the different areas and making sure that they are actually seen as a competent person when they actually get onto site. Right, so definitions are very important, and obviously there's a lot of those we can cover, but I just wanted to focus on these basic ones as, you know, as per the construction regulations. If we look at the OSHA Act, obviously, as I've indicated, there's really a lot of regulations and legislations that we can refer to. But if you look at the two main ones we typically refer to is your general safety regulations and your construction regulations. Now, there's been a few questions. We've got clients out of the mining industry, and obviously the Mining Health and Safety Act doesn't address working rights as clearly as the OSHA Act and specifically the construction regulations do. So it's very important also to mention that, you know, even if you're in a mining environment and you're working at heights, it doesn't really remove your requirement to wear harnesses and lanyards and have fall protection plans in place, because they normally, the legislation says that if the one part of the legislation does not address working a certain aspect or a topic that you need to address, you fall back to the next one that does. And obviously this is where, even on a mining environment, construction regulations must be followed purely because it addresses working right directly through obviously the regulations that you can see there on the slide, which I'll get to, and because the guys are exposed to those hazards and risks. So if you look at the general safety regulations, just to run through them very briefly, you will see regulation 3, you've got your nature of the hazard. If your nature of your hazard is being exposed to a fall risk, obviously you need to have harnesses, nets, fall arresters, lifelines, safety hooks, or similar equipment in place. And typically this is the part of the regulation that we refer when the guys ask us, but you know, why do we need to wear harnesses and lanyards? And is it really important, or is it a must-have, or is it a nice-to-have? Now, obviously, working at heights, there's nothing like a nice to have. It's always a you must have. And obviously, this is the regulation that we refer to, making sure that even if you're in a very low ground clearance area, you need to make sure that you have appropriate systems in place to effectively manage that hazard and risk that you are exposed to. If you look at Regulation 6, no person shall work in an elevated position unless performed from a ladder or scaffolding. And obviously, this is also ensuring that there is safe access, safe platforms. Both of those elements, the ladders and the scaffolding, carry the ladder, for instance, carries the EN 131 standard. The scaffolding itself carries the SAN standard, which needs to be aligned to. And not that it's always applicable or always able to use these platforms, but these do provide some way of a safer platform at the end of the day when exposed to working rights, or when you work and you need to do maintenance in certain areas, you can use those effectively. If you look at the construction regulations, you've got your duties of the client, very important. Obviously, they do indicate there the baseline risk assessment. Regulation 9 and 10, if you look at the working right industry, is the two main ones that we always focus on. It's the ones their competency is extremely important. Your risk assessor, obviously having a look at the high risk environments, have to assess those risks, put mitigation in place, controls in place to actually manage the risks when the guys are exposed to working rights. So this is a very important part, and this is also where the legal appointments come into play for your fraud protection planner, where your risk assessor and your planner is two of those legal appointments that you need to have in place. They must be competent, they must be trained, they must be skilled. They should have a great deal of experience, as far as I'm concerned, because at the end of the day, you cannot have gaps and gray areas in the environment where they need to manage and control those hazards and risks. So very important, the risk assessment before and during work by a competent person. The Regulation 10, your fraud prediction plan, competent person appointed in writing. And I think one point that's very important is also that many people, when they do their fraud prediction plans and fraud prediction planners, sometimes forget about this regulation. In my opinion, they do the fraud prediction plan based on the way that they see the document being laid out. But if you look at the regulation, it's very clear. There needs to be 5 elements to your fraud prediction plan, and that is typically a risk assessment, which is your baseline document. You need your medical fitness in that or management procedure for your medical fitness of the guys, your training procedure, your inspection, servicing, and maintenance procedure, which for me, again, is an extremely important part of a fraud prediction plan, because that's how you make sure the guys are using certified systems, it's being inspected, and there's a process of managing that equipment when on site, especially when working in exposures where you've got dust, gases, hardened environments, where you've got a lot of exposure to rust and all of those elements that you need to manage, especially when working with certified systems and systems that needs to be installed in those areas. And obviously the last and important one is your rescue plan. Your fraud prediction plan is just as good as your rescue plan. And at the end of the day, if your rescue plan is not in place and not effective, you can have a brilliant fraud prediction plan, but if the guy falls and something should happen, you will be doing a recovery and not a rescue. And that is something that you need to prevent, and that we want to make sure that you prevent. So those are some of the most important ones out of the legal environment, especially when talking about fraud prediction plans. When you look at the other regulations, Regulation 11, obviously talking about structures that needs to be safe. You're talking about Scaffolding Regulation 16. Obviously, everybody knows about the SAN standard, the 10085, making sure that the scaffolding is being set up, especially steel scaffolding is set up. You've got the necessary appointments in place, your scaffold supervisors, your erectors, inspectors, the documentation, the registers. And obviously, making sure that when that green tag goes on there, that the guys know that these scaffolding structures are actually safe, and they can use that when accessing the different areas where they need to actually perform the high risk activities. And at the end of the day, when a scaffolding is being built according to the SAN standard, as a person accessing that structure, you always assume that, listen, if the green tag is there, I can climb up, I can hook up, I can use the structure, it will be safe. And obviously, this is something that's also very important. Again, if your structure that you're accessing is unsafe, it doesn't matter what you're carrying on your body or what you're attaching to, you will still be exposed. And that is a very important point. I think that's also something that we always emphasize as part of the training process when we talk about the glides. The harness can be as sufficient as you want, and it can have these nice shock absorbing elements. But if you attach to an uncertified anchor point or to a structural anchor point that's actually damaged, or the integrity is not in place, you're going to be exposed. If you look at the other document, I mean, these are not ones that we typically refer to, but I think it's very important as well. I mean, if you look at the employer duties, Section 8, provide and maintain a healthy working environment. But I think the second one for me is the most important one, and this is typically where you get the feeling that when guys sitting in training, they see it as a laborious exercise where they just need to be there because they have to be there. But if you look at the detail, it says the workers' health and safety, they need to look after that by providing instruction, information, training, and supervision. And by employer sending you on training, it's not to have a tick box covered. The employer sends you because he sees that training will actually improve your skills on site, open your eyes to the hazards and risks when you're actually exposed to working rights, and provide you with that necessary information to at least make sure that you do the thought process in your mind that when you approach an area, that you can look at the area, see where the problems is, and be part of that process of addressing it, being a toolbox talk or a risk assessment that must be provided before that. So a very important part of the legislation, and that most of the employers these days are extremely set on to make sure the guys are actually competent. Section 14, general duties of employees. Obviously, safety starts with yourself. Most of the times, that's a very important message to bring across. It's not just a bumper sticker that you normally want to put onto a person and get him motivated. It's a very important point because at the end of the day, you can train a person so much, you can give him so much information. At the end, that human factor is always part of it. And I think it's also a culture thing where you need to make sure that there is that safety culture built into the guys where they need to understand that training and the equipment is not to create production problems or irritate the person while working rights. Is there to actually save his life, and that's why training is so important, and the employees must understand that. One of the most important points I normally take out of this is that you always look after the person next to you when working rights, because you never work right alone. And that buddy system is typically where a point like Section 14 will be very important, where you highlight this, especially when we start training our fall protection planners to make sure they actually convey that message into their plans when developing them. Then the last one, just a brief rundown. Obviously, like I said, the legislation is huge. The ARSH Act, I don't want to run through all of that, but you've got your legal appointments in place, and obviously these are also very important. Your 8-1 appointments, you've got your first aiders, your incident investigators, obviously your fall protection planners, your risk assessors. Typically rescuers is not a legal appointment, but I mean, you normally appoint a guy according to his responsibility and the competency that he received. But even though not being a legal appointment, these are extremely important points. And if a person is appointed, he must make sure that he actually perform those duties diligently to make sure that he can look after the safety of the personnel. You've got your roof work. Most of the guys I pick up sometimes don't really address this in the approach towards working rights. And there's a regulation in the construction regulations that actually address roof work. The roof erectors must be trained, roof work must be planned properly. So it's important to reference this, because at the end of the day, if you look at working rights, it's not just a harness and lanyard. It's also legally complying to what the regulations and the legislation and the sections within the ARSH Act says. And this is typically a good starting point. Look at what it says and fill up and make sure that you increase the information from that baseline that the legislation provide. Medical surveillance is covered in there. Confined spaces is covered in there as well. Now, obviously, confined spaces for a working right person is sometimes very strange, but you use typically the same type of harnesses. You sometimes incorporate lanyards. You've got self-retracting lifelines as recovery systems or evacuation systems within these very highly risk areas. And obviously, that's also where there's you have to look at the legislation covering both of these activities to make sure that you cover your bases. Scaffolding, as indicated, suspended platforms, your incident investigations, and obviously with working rights after an incident, never nice to have one of these on your site. But should it happen, what's the learnings we took from this? How can we improve the process? Why did it happen? Where was the gaps? Can we close the gaps? And obviously, at the end of the day, was the equipment that we used sufficient? Did they fail? And obviously, is there things we need to look at, or was the guy trained and he just simply forgot to do anything? Or if he was trained, what happened? At the end of the day, it's a very important part of the legislation that we need to do. It's not pointing a finger, it's always finding out the why at the end of the day. And then, of course, a very important thing these days, you'll see a lot of rooftops currently still has the asbestos sheets on there. We've done a workshop a while back covering that, and obviously a very highly risked, a very high risk environment, not purely because of the working rights that you have to walk on the roof, but also the exposure to the asbestos. And the integration of that is important. Obviously, that's where the skills of the person that actually refers to the legislation as part of the planning process must be very detailed, and obviously have a look at these regulations to make sure that it covers all the bases. So with that part of the legislation, I mean, these are just the main ones I wanted to focus on. If you've got any questions regarding this, you're more than welcome to ask. But with that, I'm going over to the next section, and that is closing the gap between the legal compliance and international best practices. So when you look at the role players as part of the industry these days, you've got your Department of Labor, obviously the guys that typically go on the site, have a look at the compliance of the contractors or the personnel that's actually performing the work. The legislation itself, as we just discussed, you've got your certification, your training providers according to the NQF and your SAQA standards. You've got your equipment suppliers, the guys that's manufacturing, the OEMs. And of course, you've got your employers as well. Obviously, the company itself, they talk about training and skills development within the company, and the supply of personal protective equipment. Obviously, making sure that all these guys are part of the process. When you look at the approach towards working rights, that all of these must be part of the process to make sure that they are aligned. The standards are being kept up to the required levels. The training is according to the requirements. And at the end of the day, the safety of the person is actually the focus point. So if you keep that in mind, then we move over to this slide where we talk about the requirements of how do you get that integrated approach? Because at the end of the day, we are in an environment where, there's I get this feeling there's always an approach towards you just want to legally comply. If the legislation says it, that's all I'm going to do, nothing more, nothing less. And that is a bit of a challenge, because if you look at the working and rights environment, and I've said it numerous times, is that it is not enough. Legal compliance will not cover everything that you need to make sure your guys are working right safely. Now, why I'm saying that is that if you look at the OSH Act 85 and you look at the relevant regulations that I've just mentioned, you look at the definition of a fall prevention equipment, it says that you need to have harnesses, lanyards, and lifelines. Now, that is very vague, to be honest, because at the end of the day, if you look at the risks the guys are exposed to these days, purely out of working on rooftops, working in very confined spaces, having been lowered into areas, working on high-rise buildings, doing maintenance and cleaning, you can't just tell a person to have a harness, because you've got various harnesses out there. You've got different types, different standards, various standards that you need to combine at the end of the day to give a guy a proper harness. If you look at lifelines, for instance, you've got different types of permanent, temporary lifelines, horizontal, vertical. You've got rope weaving systems. So the legislation does provide guidance there, but it doesn't provide you with the necessary standards and the requirements for those different aspects. Because if you only use that, you will normally have the guys going out, buying the cheapest on the market. They will normally get a single leg lanyard, snap hook at the end, which is too small for anything, a very cost-effective harness. And, is that actually sufficient at the end of the day? Yes, in certain environments, you can use that, but in certain environments, you can't. And that's where you need to move over to your second level, and that is your national and international standards. And this is where I'm going to talk to you about it a little bit later on, but you've got your SANS and your EN and your ISO standards. If you refer back to training, for instance, you've got your unit standards in there. But if I talk about a harness, then you talk about things like when you want a suspension harness, you have to typically keep in mind that a suspension harness carries an EN 361, an 813, and a 358 standard. So, many people think there's only one standard to a harness, but it's actually all three. If you look at the suspension harnesses, typically that rope access guys use. If you want to have a work positioning harness, you need to have a work positioning belt. It carries a standard, the EN358 standard. So you need to make sure that that's incorporated. So if you go back to legal compliance, you already see that there's, just purely by looking at the standards, you can now get more specific in terms of what is the requirement, what is the work the guys will do, and what type of equipment do they need. And you get more detail. If you go to your industry standards, and that's obviously your next level, and that is where you've got your professional bodies. And, we are part of the IHH, and I'm not saying this just purely because of that, but I believe the IHH has created a brilliant environment where you've got a lot of specialists out there that came together and decided, how can we make the industry safer? And they brought out things like your guidelines for safely working rights. And I think as a person exposed to that high-risk environment through a management process, you need to have some sort of referencing tool that can, at least guide you in the right direction. And that is also very important, because if you look at areas like MUPS, That is not a speciality of anybody out there, but it gives you so much detail and guidance on that. Over and above what the legislation says or what the standard says, the industry standards then provide you with that little bit of more detail in terms of taking what you have in level 1 and 2 and implementing that and using that to effectively manage that environment where you're going to work at, keeping in mind things like your inspection, servicing and maintenance, what are the do's and don'ts in terms of using that equipment. And I think it's extremely valuable to have that in mind. The last level there obviously came company standards, and never forget about that. And I think a very important point there as well, and we're talking about standards a little bit later on, is that most of our clients also have a global footprint. And this is typically where your global standards come into play, where we're not just looking at your SAN standards, they're looking at your ANSI standards, your EN, your ISO standards. They've got a global approach towards working around different environments, different countries, different legislation. But there's still that standard, if you look at the equipment, that you need to keep in mind, and the way to use that stays within a global footprint, where working with a harness in the US is the same as working in a harness in South Africa. It's just the standard that's a little bit different, but at the end of the day, you need to keep that in mind as well. And at the end, closing the gap means that when you have your legal compliance as your first level, you must always make sure that you incorporate all 4 of these levels into your planning process. Because if you do that, you take away that gaps, you take away leaving the thought process to the guys that actually must make the decision on the ground, and which can expose them because they don't necessarily have that necessary knowledge and training up to the level where you might. And it also makes sure that when you incorporate this, you don't just have a legally compliant plan, you've got a process, you've got an international best practice process. So with that as background, if we look at the standards now the standards that I'm going to discuss is 3 that I just focused on. Obviously, there's a few other ones that we can look at as well, like your Australian standards and your American standards. But I wanted to focus on these 3 ones simply because these are the ones that we typically find the most in South Africa. Now, if you look at the European norm, I've given you a little bit of a definition of what the European norm or the European standards are there. Just a little bit of a definition that I provided there just as reference if nobody else knows what they are. The ISO standards, again, a small little definition, and I think everybody knows the STAN standards. But what I try to indicate is that the 2 international ones out of here is your EN and your ISO standards. And on the right-hand side, you will see the national standard, the STAN standard, and that is obviously the local standard that we follow. But, you know, if you look at the harnesses these days, especially when, if I can maybe use the harness as an example, you will see that sometimes they only carry the STAN standard. And in the industry, it's a bit of a funny approach when you go to them with the EN harness and you say, all right, here's the EN 361 harness and it's certified, and they say, no, I need a SAN standard on your harness. And I think it's sometimes a bit of a lack of information where the guys don't really understand that the SAN standard is directly adopted from your EN standard. So if you look at your EN 361, which is your European norm standard for your full body harness, the 50361 for your SAN standard is exactly the same. There's absolutely no difference. And it's small things like that that is very important to understand as well, because then you can approach the situation a little bit different in terms of using various equipment. You don't have to go for the local equipment yourself, or you can have a combination of the 2 where you can incorporate that, use that, because at the end of the day, the local market, if you look at the global footprint that some of the companies have, the range of equipment they can provide is absolutely massive. They can cover any industry, any type of environment with a typical piece of equipment, but it's not necessarily SAN standard. A SAN certified product, but it's got an EN certification. And if we can start incorporating that and using that in the industry, it makes, it's very important, because then you can start making sure that you can cater for any type of environment that you find on your site or any type of risk area. Now, a small little thing that I just wanted to mention, I think I've covered it already, and that is your EN and your SAN standard, which is typically used in South Africa and accepted, obviously with the different types of equipment, with the different type of standards. But you will see at the end, I just wanted to highlight the fact that the SANS just adds the 50 in front, obviously making sure that it's the SAN standard, the local standard. And then I thought, well, let's look at the 2 different standards, because you've got your EN standard, which is the international standard. You've got your SAN standard, which is a local standard. And have a look at a few advantages and disadvantages of each, just to cover a few points. Now, If you look at the advantages, I said there, the EN and the SANS, they are aligned in testing and certification. Now, why I said that is that if you look at the EN 361 and the SANS 50361, they typically test harnesses up to 100 kilograms. So when you buy a harness from either an EN 361 supplier, international supplier, or a guy that locally that can supply these harnesses, or you buy a SANS harness that's according to the 50361, they do certify the harnesses to the same weight rating, which is 100 kilograms. Obviously, you know, the global guys have got different approaches because they're in different markets. There's different size people they get exposed to. And obviously, there's differences in the weight rating that they can assign to the different aspects and the different standards. Like, for instance, your ANSI standard, you've got harnesses that can go up to 180 kilograms. Which is very strange for South Africans because we never get exposed to people of that weight to be working right. But you do get that in the international market. Locally, obviously, the SANS harnesses, the heaviest rating that I've seen is about 140 kilograms. If you look at the second point, it says EN and SANS is accepted across South Africa and obviously into Africa. You know, various countries do work with this equipment. They don't really necessarily only work with the EN standards, they work with the SANS as well. Obviously, they understand the standards a little bit better, and you can go into a country like Zambia where the guys are working. But obviously, you've got companies like your Lafarge that's got a local head office in South Africa. They've got a branch in Zambia, and obviously these align to each other. And obviously that's also one of the reasons why they can use that. But a very important point to keep in mind as well. Then, of course, you've got your SANS. That's, you know, obviously the local market is more cost-effective equipment. There's no import duties that you normally have to look at, and focus on industries in terms of pricing and availability. So, you know, you've got your construction industry where you've got a lot of guys working on height, a lot of harnesses you need to buy on a regular basis. And, you know, sometimes the EN standard does allow for a bit of a more costly product, where the SANS standard can provide you with a bit more cost effectiveness or cost saving, if you can look like that. At the end of the day, obviously cost does make a difference, but quality is a very important point that you need to keep in mind as well. Now, if you look at the EN International, it says they're more price sensitive, but high quality and suits any risk environment. And I think that's a very good example of where the international standards are very important to keep in mind as well, especially when you're working in very high risk environments or high exposure levels, where you've got, you know, oil and gas rigs, oil platforms that you need to work with. You've got some petrochemical environments where you're working with very high explosive environments. Then obviously, you know, your local standards, your SANS standards, or local providers or manufacturers don't really cater sometimes for that. And that's where your international standard, your international products can have a better approach. The EN, obviously the global footprint as OEMs, you know, they've got a longer certification. I think that's an interesting point as well, which I've picked up some of the clients don't know. But, you know, the SANS standard, if you look at the disadvantages at the bottom, you know, your SANS typically certify everything for 5 years. From date of manufacture. And obviously, at the end of the day, the international guys with your EN certifications and your ANSI or your Australian certifications, they normally get up to a 10-year certification. And that makes a big difference if you look at the longevity of the products, if you look at the amount of time being on site and where the guys can use that. You know, obviously with high exposure levels, you're not going to get to 5 years. But, you know, in certain environments where they're being used, yes, you can go more than 5 years. And I think that's a very important point to keep in mind as well. When in keeping standards in mind and keeping the products that you require on site in mind. And then an interesting point, local move towards alignment with international standards. One of the most important examples I can have is your SANS 10333. That was the SANS standard that looked after equipment inspection and maintenance. And it's been changed now to the ISO 22846. And they've adopted that and made it into the SANS 22846 standard. And that's a very important point because, again, I think it's important that the South African or the local market aligns to the international standards because of the detail, the technical, the quality, everything that it brings to the industry. That will just make sure that the equipment and the way we approach working rights, it's much safer. Right, disadvantages. I've mentioned there the 5-year certification, no global approach towards some of the high-risk industries. You know, you can see it as a disadvantage, or you can just see that at the end of the day, you know, if you need something very unique, you can go and look in the international market. But I get the feeling that the local market is just focusing on getting high turnover in some of the industries, which is not a problem. But at the end of the day, the standard, the sand standard, it is a local standard aligned to the national standard. But if you look at the specifications behind some of the products, they don't get to the international level because of the approach of some of the manufacturers. And then I made a question mark on the quality, and I'm going to leave that as a rhetoric question. I don't want any answers on that, but that's a food for thought at the end of the day, which you can discuss maybe offline or somewhere when we meet on a site somewhere. Right. So with the standards being covered, I just wanted to touch on the considerations in selecting fall protection equipment. And this is, you'll see I've used this slide again, a reference back to your levels. And if you select the fall protection equipment, obviously these are the two main levels that we typically keep in mind. You are guided by your legal compliance, but you also need to reference your national and international standards because at the end of the day, it does link back to your equipment. It does provide you with that legal requirement of what you need to have in place, and you need to align that to your risk environment. So what I've done is I've just given a few photographs there. And I think one of the biggest considerations when selecting fall protection equipment is typically the environment in which you're going to work. There's no typical generic fall protection equipment that will cater for all four of these environments, as you will see in front of you. The reason being said is that if you look at environment number one, you will see that it's actually a confined space environment. There's a lot of dust. There's a lot of exposure levels in there. The harness itself must carry D-rings on the shoulders because you're lowering a guy into a vertical hole or a bin. You need to make sure that the personnel wears harnesses that might be a repellent feature where the dust and the moist within those environments don't penetrate the webbing and cause any serious damage or can actually cause it to fail over certain periods. If you look at the second environment, obviously climbing up a vertical cat ladder, typically you can have a standard harness and lanyard climbing up, but also, keep in mind, if you look at the structure that they're accessing, there's no edge protection. So how do you approach this? How do you make sure that the equipment that you have it allows for safe access, but does it allow you to work on that structure safely? For instance, if you have to set up anchor points and you have to use the restraint system, you have to have a front D-ring. And you need to keep that in mind even before you need to tell the guy to climb up vertically on a cat ladder. And those are some of the considerations that you need to keep in mind. If you look at the third environment, rooftops, and I think this is typically one of the highest risks that we currently have in South Africa in the industry, and that is, maintenance on rooftops, replacing of typical areas like your asbestos rooftops. And on rooftops, I think the biggest problem that you have is that you've got a lack of anchor points. There's sometimes not very safe access onto these rooftops. The sheeting itself is old, it's rusted, it might be asbestos, that's extremely fragile. And it's a very difficult environment to plan for, and it requires a great deal of skills from the guys that actually approach these environments. And also equipment, you need to make sure that you've got the necessary equipment in place. Not just purely for working rights on these environments, but also what if a guy falls off? What if he needs to be rescued? How do you get him down onto the level? Because you've got sharp edges, you've got skylights where the guy can possibly fall through. Do I need to provide a guy with a system that restrains him effectively from limiting the fall clearance? Because you typically have manufacturing or production areas below where you can actually hit the person at the bottom. So there's so much considerations, and that influences how you select your fall protection equipment as well. And then the fourth one on the right-hand side, climbing up a truck or an area where you need to do, for instance, tarping. If you look at this type of area, you need to look at the overhead structures. Is there an overhead anchor point? If not, can I install can I install systems within the rooftop? What do I need to provide the person with? Because if you give him a harness and a lanyard, you need to make sure that your fall clearance is kept in mind. Because if he falls off using a standard lanyard and is attached at his feet, then he's going to hit the ground, and you need to manage that effectively. And obviously not taking away from engineering controls, and that's obviously your first option. But what if those are not available? How do I make sure that I manage this if I can use fall protection equipment? And those are some of the thoughts that I just want to leave you with when you look at these different areas and things you need to keep in mind, consider when selecting fall protection equipment. Now, just to give you a background, and this is, I'm talking now out of my 3M experience, and that is that 3M in itself has got about 20,000 products in its range, working right fall protection range. They've got about 180 full body harnesses, roughly about 150 types of lanyards. They've got 170 types of fall protection for tools products in their range. And they've got South Africa. We've got about 1,000 products that's EN certified that we typically can push into the market. But you know, if I tell you that it looks very impressive, but how do you select out of that 20,000 or even the 1,000? How do you select the equipment appropriate for the task? And that is, I think, sometimes a very difficult tool as well, because is it the right type of equipment for the environment? Is it going to cover the fall clearance that I need to have? And I think that's also where this knowledge and the skills come into play to make sure that you select the equipment appropriately. And obviously, if you survey your area, your risk area properly, you can have a very good idea in terms of what you need. And obviously, that's also where in the sourcing process comes into play, where you need to go and look for that specific type of equipment for that environment. So where we typically start is that, you know, we've got the ABCDs. If you look at that, obviously, we always ask the question, do you have an anchorage point available, an anchor point? Do we have body support? What type of body support do we need? What is the connectors we're going to use? And there's, like I've indicated, there's a lot of these connectors. And very importantly as well, you know, it's not just the fall protection equipment. It's not purely just the harness and lanyard or the connectors and the harnesses and the anchor points. It's also the descent and rescue requirements. You know, what if a person falls with that equipment that I've selected? What do I do then? And that's part of the selection process. So these are typically a quick guide that you can use. If you approach a situation, ask the question, what do I have anchor points? If not, you need to make sure you cover that tick box. What type of body support do I need? What's the activity the guy's going to perform? Is he simply going to climb up, climb down, or is he going to move on structures where there's no edge protection? Do I need to have him attached to a permanent lifeline system and he needs to move around using a rope grab on his front gearing? The connectors that he's going to use, can I give him a standard lanyard? Do I need to give him something different? And if I rescue a person, you know, is the height of the rescue system sufficient? Can the rescue system do multiple rescues, for instance? Does the system keep in mind that you need to haul up a 150-kilogram person while being suspended? Is that system designed for that type of mechanical advantage? Small little things like that, but obviously asking the ABCDs, it's already a starting point. It's already a place from where you can start. Now, there's a few questions you can ask yourself as well, and this, I think I've covered most of these. Just a few points that I've put on the slide, and this is you know, typically activity that will be performed. What is the person going to do at height? Is he only going, like I indicated, climbing up, climbing down? Is he going to do work positioning? Does he need to use both hands? Is he going to do cleaning? Is there a lot of dust exposure because of the harness? Is there moist that he will be exposed to? Is there a high risk of a person falling? Making sure, is it a low ground clearance area, like for instance, working on containers or trucks? What is the guy going to do? And ask that question because that will guide you in terms of the working rights equipment as well. Availability of fall protection equipment. Obviously, do you have systems in place? What do I need to add? What do I need to get as part of that? Access to and from the risk area. You know, if I climb up a cat ladder, or do I use a ladder to get up there? A ladder is typically not always a very safe environment, but, you know, can I integrate that with a vertical lifeline system to actually allow the guy to climb up and shoot the ladder fall? Can that be sufficient? Work platforms, is it available? How do I integrate my fall protection plan with that? Typically scaffolding, you know, you've got your aluminium structures that you can use as well. And, you know, how do I incorporate my equipment with that? And how can I make sure that it's the right equipment? And obviously ask the question, what's above and below? You know, fall clearances, limiting the fall clearance and the amount of shock that you put on a person's body when he falls is very important. And you need to plan for that. You need to make sure that you cover that as part of your considerations. Then if you look at anchor points, obviously temporary anchor points, you know, is there concrete, steel, wedge anchor points? Is there sliding or fixed beam anchors? You know, we typically call these mobile anchor points. And the mobile anchor points is, I'll show you a little bit later when we look at the physical pictures, but you can use it, install it according to EN 795 Class B certification. You can remove it from that same area and use it in a different area. And those are typically a very important point you need to look at, because you don't want to install something, keep it there, and it's going to be a once-off. You need to make sure that you look at the longevity of this equipment and is it actually applicable and can it be used effectively. Permanent anchor points, you know, if you look at those anchor points installed, pull tested, certified, the recertification of that. If you're going to work on a rooftop on a regular basis, on a, you know, on an annual basis, cleaning, maintenance, You know, some of your cement factories have got absolutely a massive amount of dust on those rooftops, and you need to clean those because otherwise it's going to expose and actually cause some of the rooftops to collapse. So instead of looking at temporary systems, have a look at permanent systems, and those are part of your considerations. How do I integrate my equipment with that permanent systems and make sure that it's actually safe? I've just given you a bit of a layout in terms of certified systems. I'm not going to run through this in detail. I don't want to waste too much time. I see you've got a few minutes left. But I mean, if you look at certified systems, if you consider anything, you know, always have a question. Do I need lifelines or anchor points or both? If I need lifelines, is it vertical or horizontal application that I need for? If I use vertical, is it rope or cable systems? And obviously, if you look at the rope and cable systems, there's different lengths, different requirements, different standards you need to comply with. But these are typically the questions and type of organograms that you can put in place just to guide you to ask the right questions. And if you ask the right questions to the right people, you're going to get the right answer and you're going to get the right equipment on site. Then obviously keeping in mind with the ABCDs, I just wanted to highlight some of the systems that we've looked at. So if you look at the left-hand side corner, you will see I've linked that to the consideration of A, anchorages. You will see this is typically a concrete wedge anchor. It's a temporary anchor that we install into a concrete wall. You will see there's a temporary lifeline attached to that. 20 mil hole drilled, popped into the anchor, it pops into the hole, and all you do is you release. And it stays in there. You can attach a temporary lifeline, but when you're done, you remove that anchor and you can put it into a different area. A very effective tool, certified to a 795 Class B, but it's a mobile anchor, and it brings around cost effectiveness, extremely safe in terms of the application. It looks very small, but it's extremely safe. We've used this numerous times on some of our clients where temporary work needs to be done on buildings on the outside of the areas where they need to do painting or removing of glass or anything like that. If you look at another anchor point, obviously you've got your certified anchor points. You've got these, we call them M211s. You will see you've got your pool testing, the small little photograph on the right. Installed more permanent installations. If you have to do regular maintenance on buildings, rooftops, certain areas where you don't have any anchor point available, you need to install these, have it pool tested. And obviously very important is the certification part of that as well. When you select anchor points, don't just go for anything that looks fine. You have to require the certification part of it because that will give you that legal compliance. Manufacturer specifications is met, and at the end of the day, should something go wrong, you've got the legal backing behind it, that you've done everything reasonably practical to make sure that the anchor point was installed by a competent authorized installer and the guys were using it effectively as per the requirements. If you look at the B, the body support, you will see there's a typical example of what we call a Delta harness. It's got rappel technology. I just want to highlight these points. A very important point to look at, rappel technology. So it, if it gets exposed to dust and moist, it actually repels that. So it doesn't penetrate the webbing. You can use it for numerous times. You will see it's actually applied in our confined space environments. And look at the weight rating. It's got a heart of the 40 kilogram rating. So you don't want to put a big guy into a confined space, but if you have to, it's got that weight rating available and you can use that. It is certified to that standard. And if you look on the right-hand side, it incorporates into your davit systems, your winches, your recovery SRLs. And I think that's a very important point where, don't just typically look at the person going in. What is the outside requirements as well? Because with these systems, you can have a non-entry rescue. You don't have to put a second person at risk when you have to do a rescue. If you look at your C connectors, I've given you a bit of a construction reference there. You will see this is on a slab that they're throwing into a building that they're erecting. And you will see there's guys standing on top. There's some rebar sticking out. So obviously, the best approach in this case, because you've got an open edge, you need to prevent the guys from falling. Or if they fall, they need to be attached to a system. You will see that we've suggested our temporary webbing lifeline system. Obviously, it's got a 20-meter weight rating. It can have 2 guys in full arrest, 3 guys in the restraint. But we incorporate that with what we call a nanolock system. And if I can highlight that, you will see it says it's got a dedicated foot level tie off, which means you can stand on top of a truck. You can have that lanyard attached to your harness, and you will only have a 2.8 meter fall clearance necessary. Because of the self-retracting systems that's built into that unit, you can hook up at your feet, and should you fall, you will only have that limited fall clearance. And that's a very important point to keep in mind. You will see it's got sharp edge rated as well. So obviously on slabs, concrete slabs, you've got sharp edges. And if you fall with the standard webbing lanyard there, it will physically cut and it will tear that whole lanyard apart. Obviously, the shock absorber will deploy as well, where this unit is certified for those sharp edges, and it's got a weight rating of 141 kilograms. So it does make a massive difference when you look at all the factors, ask the questions, and you look at all your considerations, and you decide to have the most effective tools on hand. The last one is, I'll open up all of these. I just wanted to show descent and rescue options. You've got your recovery and auto evacuation SRLs, or your auto evacuation SRLs. You know, typically functions as a full arrest block, but it can also function as an auto evacuation unit, especially when you have to evacuate a certain area. Petrochemical environments use this when the gantries are being loaded. So there's always a few things that you can have a look at. In the middle part, you've got your R550. Up to about 5 different types of rescues. It's got a 40-to-1 ratio. So even hauling up a 200-kilogram person, you're dividing that person's weight by 40, making sure you can do a smooth, quick rescue, making sure that those things are in place. And you can do remote rescues, you can do conscious and unconscious rescues. Extremely versatile system. But these are typically considerations that you need to keep in mind if you look at your areas, the risk areas, and what you're going to use. And then something which is not available in South Africa, I just wanted to give you the international flavor a bit. That is a self-rescue system. It's a pack that the Americans use very effectively. They attach it to the back of the harnesses, and in case they should fall, they actually, like a parachute, you actually pull the handle, the arrow indicates the handle, you pull that handle, and you can evacuate up to 15 meters using that self-pack on your harness. Now, obviously, you have to be conscious to do that, but in itself, you provide the person, if he should fall, with a self-rescue system that's extremely effective. And those are also, again, considerations that you need to keep in mind, and that's available in the market out there. Lastly, obviously, built on the activities that you're going to do, you incorporate work positioning lanyards. You know, if there's edge protection, you can have a look at cable slings. You know, obviously taking away the edge, the scenario of having a hazardous area that's got a sharp edge that you need to attach a lifeline to. You need the cable systems. Vertical systems for climbing up and using for restraint on rooftops. You've got your rope grabs, and obviously integrating rope into your systems are always very effective because these are certified as well, EN 1891, and it's got about a 2.5 ton breaking strength. So, you know, there is so much equipment available these days. So the considerations is a great deal. You've got a lot of equipment that you can have a look at, but I think when you assess your areas effectively, you can get to a point where you can decide what is the best approach, what is the best equipment to use, and you can then align your guys and the equipment on site to that requirements. Great, thank you very much. I think I hit that on the button. Maybe 1 or 2 minutes over. Thanks, Dylan.
Awesome, thank you so much, Anderson. I don't know how people feel. I know last time there was a request to have a quick 5-minute break just to go to the toilet, get some water. Thumbs up if that's a need, or can we just shoot straight into some of the questions that we had? Cool. I'm going to take that as we just move on. So Anderson, just to cover quickly, so Samantha did have a question during the session. She was asking who's typically responsible for drawing up a rescue and a fall protection plan, and what qualifications should this person have?
Yeah, great question, Samantha, and thank you very much for that. You know, in the regulation 10, they talk about a competent person that can develop, implement, and revise a fall protection plan. So that is the person drawing it up. It's a qualified and certified fall protection planner as per the regulations. And the training the person needs is typically a 22994 unit standard. So they call it US 22994. It says assess a work site for work right and prepare a fall protection plan. Now, there's various courses where in the market these days you can either do that 1 unit standard, or if you go through an IAA's provider like ourselves, we integrate that with a basic fall arrest, making sure you understand the equipment before you plan for the equipment. But in a nutshell, that is basically what you need and who can actually develop your fall protection plans.
Awesome. Thanks, Anderson. I'm going to ask everyone to just give a bit of thought. If there are any questions in closing before I give Anderson, we only had 2 in the chat. So before we cover that one, if people do have questions, I'm going to push you to ask him. I think use this wealth of knowledge, engage with Anderson, ask questions. It can only bring value if there are any things that are grey. And we know with work at heights, it's not if something goes wrong, the worst case scenario is fatalities, and it's really not a pretty place to be. So if there's any uncertainty, I do ask Engage Anderson. The second one was from Cindy, and she just asked, what is the lifespan of a lanyard and a harness?
Yeah, thank you. That's also a good question. And at the end, it's something that I pick up the people are not really adhering to. So on the lanyard and the harness, there's normally a label. Now, if you look at the SAN standards, the local manufactured equipment, they have a 5-year certification. So on the harness and lanyard, they will typically indicate the manufacturing year, which will be, let's say, for instance, 2015. And you need to make sure that you align to that within 5 years, you need to replace that. So obviously, you need to remove that from service in 2020. Some of the manufacturers also specify a manufacturing year and when it expires. They indicate that year so that it's a bit of a more visual inspection that you can do that. I haven't seen a lot of them doing that, but some of them do that. But if you look at the international side, and obviously talking out of our own range of equipment that we have, the Protekta side, the 3M range of equipment is certified for 10 years. And that, I think that's something that when you plan for working rights, you need to keep in mind as well. Or when you do your fall protection plans, just write that into your plans that is part of your inspection and maintenance requirements, that the guys need to check that. Otherwise, you can have uncertified equipment and they might fail.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, so I guess the floor is open. I don't know if there are any questions, if anyone's got anything else. Yeah, Cindy?
Hi, Anderson. Just a question with regards to the Institute for Working at Heights. I know I once had to deal with a customer where the debate was that only training provided by the Institute of Working at Heights was valid. So what is your take on that, and how do they fit into this whole working at heights in South Africa?
Sure, that's a big question, and I'm gonna it's got a long answer. I'm gonna try and make it as short and as painless as possible, Cindy. So, it's all about the client approach. Now, the IWH in itself is not a legal entity as such. It's a professional body approved by SAQA at this point in time. It's not a legal requirement to do IWH training. You've got your CETAs in place. So you've got two options available in the market. You can either do CETA training through a purely CETA accredited training provider, and that's accepted. They certify you as a competent person, and you can work on it the same as anybody else. What the IWH has just seen is that the IWH saw that there's a gap in the market where the CETAs they don't have the specialities, the SMEs, the subject matter experts within the CETAs. They don't have the manpower because of the amount of people that work around to actually come onto site, do external moderations, and put a guy on site within a 2 or a 3 week period. So what the IWH went and did is that they said, listen, the CETAs, when you train a person through the IWH, you still upload to the CETAs. The CETA process will run in the background. We will do internal moderation from the provider side. The external moderation will be scheduled, and that will take place whenever the CETAs are available. But in the meantime, we need to get the guys on site. They need to be certified as competent. And what the IWH did is that they provided designations. Not that we know. So when we train you guys as competent, we train according to the CETA requirements, but when we certify you against the designations. So if I train you as a fall protection planner, Cindy, I will then certify you as a fall protection planner. That is a designation that the IWH provide, and that designation is only valid for 3 years. After 3 years, we then recertify you. We don't have to retrain you. We recertify you through a quick process where we just make sure that you are still on the correct level, and you get your recertification for 3 years. So if the person said the IWH is the only approved training in the industry, I don't agree with that. You've got your CETA providers out there that's absolutely brilliant, that does excellent work in terms of providing purely CETA training and getting the guys certified. The IWH is just one part of the process, and because we are IWH, it just helps us so much more because we can assist our clients much faster. The quality management side of the IWH, I must confess, is much more stringent because these guys do have specialists in their field, so you can't take shortcuts. And obviously that is very good for us because the quality is then so much more out there that we can make sure the guys are competent, they're assessed correctly, and they've got the necessary skills to safely work around.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So I've got another question here, Anderson. What's your recommendation of a good safety harness inspection for a construction site? So I don't know if that's talking about the actual process of inspections.
Yeah, maybe sorry, Dylan. Yeah, maybe I can address it in that sense. You know, on a construction site, you've got a lot of dust, a lot of guys climbing up scaffolding. You've got a lot of, you know, it's normally a bulk store where the things are being kept. You use a different harness every day. You don't use your same harness. You don't have your own kit. Construction sites is a bit of a interesting environment where working around equipment is being kept and used. And what I typically suggest is that, you know, you've got your daily before use inspections, and I think that must be very rigid. So when the guy signs for that equipment in the morning, make sure that he fills in a register, make sure that he signs for it, because it's not his that he used yesterday. He's now using another one that the other guy used. The register must be completed before he fits, before he climbs. And I think, you know, if you can have at least, if not weekly, then 2 weekly inspections by, for instance, a supervisor on site that he can maybe just check the harnesses. Is the inspections being done? Is the equipment that's being removed from service? And if so, then obviously that process must be done more regularly. So it's very difficult. It's all dependent on the client, but advisable. The daily before use inspections must be done properly, and you need to have more regular checks to make sure that those equipment are managed effectively, because on construction sites, you've got a lot of guys climbing on top of trusses, building, you know, sheeting. You've got scaffolding. You've got guys climbing various structures to do certain plastering and painting, and you need to make sure the equipment is actually effectively managed.
Awesome, thanks. Do we have any other questions? There's been some really great ones. Cool. So there were a couple questions regarding if this will be shared. So your sales team is actually on this call as well, and they'll be sharing this with you in the next week or so. It does take us a little bit to get it on online. Once it is online, though, they will share the link with you. And yeah, we hope that this has added value. Thank you so much for taking the time and spending time with Protekta. We appreciate it.